Hi folks, my name's Chris Hart. I thought I'd use a slice of lockdown time to tell you about a new book that came out last week, which I've produced in collaboration with colleagues at Lancaster University. The book's called Researching Discourse, a Practical Guide. It's primarily aimed at undergraduate students and programs of linguistics or English language who are writing coursework projects in an area of discourse analysis and or who are doing their dissertation research in discourse analysis. I thought I'd use this video to introduce you to the content, structure and format of the book, and to give you a sense of the way the book works, provide a sample of the contents from one particular chapter. Anyway, I hope you find the video useful. I hope it might be a resource in its own right for those of you currently embarking on a dissertation in discourse analysis, and especially if you're using methods based in cognitive linguistics, since that's the approach of the chapter I'm going to be focusing on here. Okay, here goes. The book is organised around 10 chapters, each representing a different approach to discourse analysis. These chapters, the book starts off with a sort of general introduction to discourse, covering definitions, debates, and the kinds of decisions that one needs to make in a research project in discourse analysis. And it provides a kind of overview of the way the text will work. The remaining chapters cover conversation analysis, discourse and ethnography more generally, discourse analysis and systemic functional linguistics. There's a whole chapter dedicated to analysing metaphor in discourse, and then a broader cognitive linguistic approach to discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis in particular. A chapter exploiting corpus linguistic methods in discourse analysis. A chapter representing the multimodal turn in discourse analysis and how to handle multimodal data. A chapter also multimodal in nature, but dedicated specifically to digitally mediated discourse analysis. And finally, a chapter looking at how experimental methods might be used in critical discourse analysis, again, in particular. So the book provides a kind of how-to guide. It's actually called Researching Discourse, a Student Guide, not Researching Discourse, a Practical Guide, as I said earlier. The idea is it will help students embarking on dissertations or other research projects in discourse analysis begin to think about certain types of questions, such as which methodological or theoretical approach should I take, what kinds of data should I analyse, and how should I set about collecting that. What consideration do I need to give to ethics prior to data collection? How can I make my analyses systematic and rigorous, and how do I report my findings? So the book takes students really through the whole research process, from conception to design to implementation and to presentation. What I'm going to do in this chapter is, in this video, is say a little bit about chapter 6 in particular, one of the chapters that I have contributed. So the book has been authored by researchers working in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University, and as such it represents our research areas in discourse analysis. But that doesn't mean that it covers all of the different approaches to discourse analysis that one can take. So each chapter follows exactly the same format, the same structure, so that you can compare across the different approaches to discourse analysis quite easily. That structure consists of an introduction and then an outline of the approach as the sort of theoretical or epistemological underpinnings of the different approach, and a little bit of a historical background to them. It then covers the kind of research questions that one answers within that approach to discourse analysis, and how you go about identifying research questions for yourself. We then, in each chapter, talk about methods of data collection available to us, and the ethical considerations we need to give before data collection. Then there's a sort of illustrative chapter which we've titled Analysing and Interpreting Data. The idea here is that each chapter comes with its own case study, which is an original case study that shows you what a discourse analysis undertaken in that approach would look like. And then we have a section presenting findings and results. So what kinds of things do we need to think about in the way we present our findings and results? And that will depend on whether the chapter or whether the method you're using has a quantitative or qualitative orientation, or perhaps it's mixed methods. And then finally, we discuss the issues and limitations of any approach, and it's really important to think about that in setting out the scope of a research project. And then finally, each chapter lists a few key readings that you would really need to familiarise yourself with if you're going to be using that approach to discourse analysis. In looking at chapter 6, I'm going to focus on the first 6 of these parts of the chapter. So, an introduction to cognitive linguistics as a basis for critical discourse analysis. Cognitive linguistics emerged in the late 20th century as a radical revision of linguistic theory, placing meaning, usage, and experientialism at the heart of its analyses. Although it developed primarily to account for traditional rank levels of linguistic structure, phonological, lexical, morphosyntactic, the focus found in cognitive linguistics on meaning and usage events makes it a particularly useful framework to work with in various areas of discourse analysis, from stylistics and poetics to critical discourse analysis. In many approaches to discourse analysis, the primary object of analysis is the text itself, its linguistic makeup, as well as the social, historical, or interactional context of which it is a part. In cognitive approaches, however, the focus shifts away from the linguistic structures of a text per se to the conceptual structures that a text evokes in the minds of readers to constitute their understanding and experience of the situations or events being described within the text. The aim of cognitive linguistics CDA is then to interpret the potential ideological effects of the conceptualizations evoked in the course of discourse. Where CDA is sometimes criticised for not taking cognition or the reader into account and for being too ad hoc in its analyses, a major motivation behind the development of cognitive linguistics CDA has been to address the impact of language choices on readers' cognition in a way that is systematic and psychologically plausible, informed by a model of language based in general cognitive principles. CLCDA inherits from cognitive linguistics a number of key epistemological commitments or theoretical assumptions about language. These include that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty, that language is linked to experience, and that language is usage-based. These positions place cognitive linguistics at odds with other approaches to language which prevailed throughout the 20th century. For example, to say that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty runs counter to the claims of Chomsky's generative grammar. According to cognitive linguistics, there is no single module of the mind responsible for language. Rather, language is distributed in cognition, adhering to the same general principles and making use of the same cognitive processes that govern and function in other areas of cognition like memory, reason, and perception. To say that language is linked to experience similarly goes against generative grammar as well as truth conditional and structuralist semantics. According to cognitive linguistics, language is linked to experience in two ways. First, language is grounded in experience, with the meanings attached to words, phrases, and grammatical structures being derived from the kind of experiences we have of our bodies and our interaction with the physical environment, as well as the kinds of experiences we have as members of a given culture. Second, language encodes experience. The meaning of a word or sentence cannot be reduced to a list of semantic features or truth conditions which must apply in order for the linguistic formulation to be correct. Rather, the meaning of a word or sentence lies in the dynamic mental representation and encyclopedic knowledge structures that it conjures. To say that language is usage-based is to say that conventional patterns of linguistic representation are not licensed by an abstract set of innately specified rules, as per generative grammar, but instead emerge to fulfill the communicative needs of speakers and then become stabilized within a given speech community. These fundamental positions give rise to a number of important corollaries. For example, one upshot is that what constitutes linguistic knowledge is not particular to language. Linguistic knowledge and processes of meaning construction in discourse are not significantly different from, and can therefore be characterized in the same terms as, structures and processes in other areas of cognition like memory and perception. This means that linguistic knowledge is essentially conceptual structure, and that meaning in discourse is achieved via processes of conceptualization. It also means that cognitive linguistics makes frequent appeal to models in cognitive psychology, including models of memory, perception, attention, and categorization, to help shed a light on the mechanisms involved in language and discourse. Another upshot is that there's no real basis on which to distinguish between different types of linguistic knowledge. Words and grammatical structures, for example, are both stored as discrete units coupled with abstract conceptual knowledge structures. They are distinguished only by the degree of abstractness in the conceptual structures they index. So from this perspective, grammatical forms are in and of themselves meaningful by virtue of the conceptual structures they conventionally evoke. Similarly, the distinction between literal and figurative language breaks down, as metaphorical expressions also index abstract conceptual knowledge structures in the form of conceptual metaphors. So at this point, you might be asking, what does all this have to do with discourse analysis? Well, a third and crucial upshot for purposes of CDA is that the linguistic choices presented by a text encode a particular construal of the target scene. Langacker defines construal as our manifest ability to conceive and portray the same situation in alternative ways. Language, in other words, enables alternative conceptions of the same or same type of social situation or event to be promoted. From a critical standpoint, particular conceptions may be seen as motivated by and as serving to maintain specific ideologies or worldviews, which in turn legitimate social actions that may be discriminatory or otherwise difficult to justify. The aim of cognitive linguistics CDA is then to delineate the conceptual parameters along which ideology and the legitimation of social action are enacted in particular discursive contexts. And here a number of construal operations, different meaning-making processes, are cued by linguistic forms, are identified as relevant. So a number of construal operations are identified as responsible for providing meaning to linguistic forms. These are incarnations of domain-general cognitive systems and processes, but in discourse they're responsible for the reproduction of ideology and the legitimation or delegitimation of social action. That is to say, they realize ideological discursive strategies. Any project in cognitive linguistics CDA will typically investigate one or more of these discursive strategies in discourse data relating to a particular social topic, group, or event. These discursive strategies are laid out in the table that you see, on the one hand in relation to the ideological discursive strategies which they realize in structural configuration, framing, identification and positioning, and on the other hand in relation to the cognitive systems and processes on which they rely, including Gestalt principles of perception, our ability to compare different aspects of experience, our ability to direct attention in different ways, and our ability to assume alternative perspectives on any scene. I'll just take you through here each of these in turn. So in structural configuration strategies, the basic structural properties of a situation or event are defined. This strategy is realized through the construal operation of schematization, whereby a particular image schema is selected as a model representing the target scene. Image schemas are abstract conceptual structures which represent recurrent patterns of embodied experience. They develop pre-linguistically but come to form the meaningful basis of linguistic units, including grammatical units. When indexed by linguistic units in discourse, then, image schemas constitute our most basic understanding of the situation or event being described in the text. Since image schemas represent complex scenes as holistic patterns of experience, this construal operation is treated as a manifestation of Gestalt principles of psychology. In framing strategies, the basic conceptualization defined through structural configuration is fleshed out with further, richer and more specific information derived from frames. Frames are encyclopedic knowledge structures representing areas of cultural experience. In discourse, they are accessed by lexical items to further shape our understanding of the target scene. Frames then provide a structured lens through which the target situation or event is seen and evaluated. Framing is realized through construal operations of categorization and metaphor, both of which are examples of a more general cognitive ability to compare areas of experience. Identification strategies concern which aspects of a given situation or event are selected for conceptual representation and to what degree of salience those aspects are represented relative to one another. Identification strategies thus have to do with inclusion and exclusion, foregrounding and backgrounding. They are realized by a group of construal operations which reflect a general ability to distribute attention over a scene in different ways. These include figure-ground segregation and windowing of attention and metonymy. Finally, positioning strategies exploit our ability to assume a different perspective on any given scene. Realized in the construal operations of point of view and deixis, positioning strategies concern where we situate ourselves in terms of space, time, and evaluation, and where we locate the position of actors, actions, and events referred to in a text relative to that position. So in the book, I take the reader through each of these construal operations, but in the presentation here, I'm going to focus specifically on schematization and windowing of attention. In CDA, cognitive linguistics provides a kind of explanatory framework where the questions it answers are typically of the how and what kind. For example, at a superordinate level, cognitive linguistics CDA helps to address questions such as how does language exert ideological influence, or what are the cognitive mechanisms by which textual influence occurs. Any project in cognitive linguistics CDA will contribute something to the general picture being built in response to these questions. However, these are not at a level that can be directly addressed in a single piece of work. Research questions for a particular project need to be more targeted, focused on a particular feature of language or conceptualization in a specific discursive context. The first thing you should be asking yourself then is, what am I analyzing? Again, this is not a research question, but a guiding question. But addressing it will help to define the topic and scope of your project. The starting point here should always be some observed phenomenon in a tested discourse practice, rather than a hypothetical language usage. The precise topic and scope of your project may be determined by something you yourself have noticed in the discourses surrounding you, which you consider worth probing further, or it may be determined by a previous study whose findings point to a particular linguistic formulation as a salient feature of a given discourse, but which does not analyze that formulation within a cognitive linguistics framework. In either case, some evidence should be supplied in the form of examples and/or results from quantitative distributional studies that the linguistic phenomenon whose conceptual reflexes you are investigating is a real and notable feature of the discourse or discourses in question. Once you have defined the topic and scope of your project, you are ready to set out your research questions proper. Your research questions should be guided by the overarching aims of cognitive linguistics CDA and asked in relation to the specific linguistic or conceptual features that you have selected for analysis. Your primary research questions will therefore look something like the following schematic questions. How is X construed in discourse Y, where X is a social group, situation or event type and Y is a topic or genre of discourse? And 2, what are the ideological implications of the construals involved? In order to address questions 1 and 2, you may want to pose slightly more refined sub-questions, such as what are the conceptual structures and processes associated with the particular linguistic form Z, and what are the potential ideological and delegitimating functions of the conceptualizations evoked by linguistic form Z in discourse Y. Often the subjective construal encoded by a linguistic formulation only becomes apparent when contrasted with an alternative formulation. Cognitive linguistics CDA therefore lends itself especially well to comparative analysis, which may be qualitative or quantitative. When comparative analysis is conducted over real-life instances of discourse, it can be along different dimensions. For example, you might compare across text producers, where the aim is to highlight the ideological worldviews promoted by different text producers, such as different newspapers. Or alternatively, you might compare within text producers, but across some other dimension, such as time, where their aim might be to chart changes in the discourse of a particular speaker or institution. Any comparative dimension that features in your analysis should be built into your research questions. Here you'll be addressing two secondary questions. Firstly, what are the alternative conceptualizations of X evoked in different discourses Y? And secondly, how do those conceptualizations vary according to dimension U, which is your variable such as speaker or time? The research questions addressed in the case study for this chapter are: how is motion construed in media discourses of migration, and what are the ideological implications and legitimating functions of the different construals identified? Unlike some other forms of discourse analysis, such as those based in ethnography or corpus linguistics, cognitive linguistics CDA is not associated with any particular type of data or method of data collection. Though it's fair to say that cognitive linguistics CDA has tended to work with texts that at least present themselves as monologic rather than texts which are manifestly dialogic, produced in more interaction or communicative settings. This includes texts such as newspaper reports, political speeches, legal and policy documents, mission statements, blog posts, and websites. In most cases, textual material is gathered from online sources. In the case of news reports, for example, this may come from newspapers' own digital archives or from online databases such as Nexus. Nexus gathers the contents of major national newspapers as well as some local publications in one place and is updated daily. It has an interface that allows researchers to easily locate and download articles containing certain search words or phrases published by particular newspapers within a specified time period. Nexus requires an institutional subscription, but most universities will hold one of these. Likewise, access to newspapers' own online content is often limited, if not completely paywalled. Again, though, most universities have some kind of access deal with those major national newspapers who do paywall their content. In the case of party political discourse, major political speeches, press releases, and election manifestos are often available via parties' own websites. Alternatively, online databases compiling speeches from across political parties can be found. For example, British Political Speech holds texts of speeches given by Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat Party leaders dating back to 1895. Depending on your data collection method as well as the research goals of your project, you may choose to work with smaller or larger numbers of texts and analyse them quantitatively and/or qualitatively, perhaps with the assistance of corpus linguistic techniques if analysing particularly large numbers of texts. What you must remember here is that decisions about data size go hand in hand with the scope of your project. For example, in a previous study of my own, I analysed just 4 texts, comparing 2 produced by The Guardian with 2 reporting on the same events produced by The Telegraph. Such small amounts of data enable qualitative analyses across a range of linguistic and conceptual phenomena. Alternatively, however, you may want to work with a much larger collection of text to explore in a quantitatively meaningful way the extent to which a particular pattern of representation is constitutive of or how it is distributed within a given discourse. This is the strategy pursued in a lot of cognitive linguistics CDA research into metaphor. Working with larger collections of text will normally mean restricting your analyses to a single linguistic or conceptual phenomena, but it also means that you can investigate that particular phenomenon in a way that allows more reliable conclusions concerning its frequency and distribution. Another entirely different approach to data, which is often taken in cognitive linguistics CDA, is to identify or collect yourself a reasonably large corpus of texts and treat this collection as a repository of examples which can be used to identify and illustrate the range of conceptual parameters along which ideology may be enacted in a given discourse. This is the strategy that I follow in the particular case study here. Whenever you conduct any kind of research project involving data, some consideration must be given to ethics, if only to safely conclude that the ethics requirements of your university do not apply to your project. When collecting text from public-facing organisations like newspapers, political parties, multinational corporations, etc., most universities are unlikely to require any formal ethics approval for your project. But please do check. All universities have procedures for obtaining ethical approval, and you should talk to your tutor or supervisor to find out about the requirements in your own institution. Examples when ethics requirements are more likely to apply include working with discourse data that is produced by individuals who are not obviously considered public figures, or which is not produced in an individual's capacity as a public figure, working with discourse data that is of a sensitive nature, which has the potential to cause offence to yourself or others, working with discourse data that has the potential to place you in any difficult or dangerous situation, and working with discourse data which to collect involves any kind of contact with other individuals or groups of people. For the case study presented in this chapter of the book, the data was gathered from 4 online newspapers, the Mail Online, the Telegraph, telegraph.co.uk, the Mirror.co.uk and the Express Online. I used Nexus to retrieve all articles published by these newspapers that contained the words immigrant or immigrants, migrant or migrants, asylum seeker or asylum seekers, and refugee or refugees in the headline in a year-long period leading up to the Brexit referendum on 23rd of June 2016. This search resulted in a bank of 8,865 texts. For the case study presented, there was no requirement to obtain formal ethics approval. I checked. Analysing and interpreting data in cognitive linguistics CDA is at least a 2-stage process addressing your 2 primary research questions. In the first stage, analysts look to establish the semantic base of the linguistic formulation or formulations under investigation. That is, analysts want to establish the conceptualizations evoked by specific language usages. At the second stage, analysts critically interpret the potential ideological or delegitimating functions of those conceptualizations within their wider discursive context. Note that this distinctly sequential approach applies only to the research process and not necessarily to the way you will present your analysis, which may integrate both description and interpretation. In the first stage, analysis is conducted with reference to particular frameworks in cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics is not a single framework then, but a paradigm made up of several frameworks addressing different aspects of language, but from a common perspective, which we outlined earlier on. Major frameworks include Langacker's cognitive grammar, Talmey's conceptual semantics, Fillmore's frame semantics, and Lakoff and Johnson's conceptual metaphor theory. Which framework you work with will depend on the linguistic and conceptual phenomena you have identified as interesting for the purposes of your study. And of course, you may want to consult with more than one framework in the course of your analysis. At the second stage, analysts rely on their own intuitions and critical thinking to evaluate the potential ideological and legitimating functions of the conceptualizations identified at stage 1. To be critical here means to go beyond the standard scientific task of describing and explaining data in as objective terms as possible, to engaging with the data as a socially concerned citizen and to consider from a particular normative or ethical standpoint its role in bringing about social injustices and inequalities. It is at this stage that construal operations are linked to ideological discursive strategies. Although this stage of analysis is necessarily subjective, reflecting your own particular stance, it is important that the analysis remains evidence-based. One form of evidence for the analysis at stage 2 is that it follows logically and convincingly from an analysis at stage 1, which applies your chosen cognitive linguistic framework both systematically and faithfully. Frameworks developed in linguistics to account for properties of language in general, outside of any particular context, carry with them a prior form of validity. Therefore, following a model of language, whether it is based in systemic functional linguistics or cognitive linguistics, in a way that is consistent and transparent, provides, at the very least, a solid basis for more interpretive claims arising from its application. For the case study in this chapter, I'm focusing on immigration discourse, media discourses of immigration, and since immigration involves most fundamentally the movement of people from one place to another, an appropriate starting point for our analysis is the extensive body of typological work in cognitive linguistics describing the semantic domain of motion, with a particular focus on Talmy's typology of motion events. For Talmy, a motion event, as it is represented conceptually, is a pattern made up of at least 4 constituent elements. A figure, namely the entity or object that undergoes motion, motion itself, or lack of it, a path along which the motion takes place, which is in turn divided into 3 elements or regions, the source, the trajectory, and the goal, and a ground, i.e. a location or landmark representing 1 and 3 path elements with respect to which the motion of the figure is characterized. In addition to these core or obligatory components, Talmy identifies 2 further elements that may receive representation: the manner and or the cause of the motion. These elements are semantic elements which get expressed in linguistic or surface elements like nouns, verbs, prepositions, adverbs, and adverbial phrases. Importantly, this relationship is not one-to-one. A single surface element may express a combination of semantic elements, or conversely, a single semantic element may get expressed across a combination of surface elements. And this can also differ across languages. For example, some languages, such as English, tend to express motion and manner together and path separately, while other languages, such as Spanish, tend to express motion and path together and manner separately. One example in English where motion and path are conflated, but manner is not specified, is in the verb enter, as in example 1. The image schema evoked by this example can be represented as in this diagram, where the figure, F, moves along a path, denoted by the arrow, to become located inside the ground. In this case, the ground is Europe. In this example, the path element selected as the ground is the goal. In not expressing manner or cause, this invented example may be said to represent the most basic or default motion event in discourse on immigration. From a critical perspective, our task is to consider how the conceptualizations evoked by actual language usages differ from this basic model, and what the ideological functions might be of alternative conceptualizations. One way in which real language usages depart from this model is through the inclusion of manner. Indeed, most English verbs of motion express motion and manner simultaneously, while path gets expressed by a preposition. When we search our data for motion verbs referring to the process of immigration, we begin to see some patterns in the way that manner of motion is construed. For example, one group relates to the activity of walking, where different verbs articulate more sympathetic versus hostile discourses. These verbs include verbs like trek and tramp. Where the path element selected as ground is typically the trajectory, walking verbs like trek, as in example 2, point to the often long and difficult journey undertaken by migrants and thus articulate a more sympathetic discourse. However, other walking verbs like tramp, as in example 3, point to the destructive effects of the motion event on the ground, or, as in the case of march, enact a military metaphor. These verbs may then be associated with more hostile discourses. Another group of verbs, also less favourable, present migrants as somehow devious or even dangerous. Verbs in this group include sneak and slip, as in examples 4 and 5 here. A further extension of this is found in verbs like smash, storm, and breach, as in example 6, which present migrants as entering the ground by physical force. These verbs also affect the conceptualization of the ground, which in these examples represents the goal. While in our earlier example of the default motion event with enter, the ground is a bounded region, it is not completely sealed. Rather, there is a designated opening which allows the figure to move freely into the ground. By contrast, in verbs like sneak and slip, the ground is supposedly sealed, but with perforations which immigrants are able to exploit to enter the ground surreptitiously. In the case of smash their way into, in the last example, the sealed ground is construed as being broken or overcome in the course of the motion event, denoted in the diagram by the stepped arrow, and this results in a change of state to the ground. The ideological functions of examples like those on the last slide compared to the default motion event then is to reinforce a discourse in which there is or ought to be restrictions to the free movement of people, and at the same time to denigrate migrants by presenting them as devious or violent in not respecting these restrictions. A final set of verbs worth noting here is a set that express manner metaphorically and thus realise particular framing strategies as well as structural configuration strategies. These verbs fall into three types: verbs to do with war, such as invade or march, verbs to do with water, such as flow, flood, stream, pour, and verbs to do with animals, e.g. flock. The metaphorical construals established by these verbs, when used in reference to the migration of people, have been extensively analysed in critical discourse analysis. However, these verbs access different source frames, water, war, animal, which then provide templates for understanding the target situation. In a cognitive account, metaphor involves 1. Establishing correspondences between elements in the source frame and elements in the target frame. 2. Attributing qualities associated with source frame elements to corresponding elements in the target frame. And 3. Making inferences about the target frame based on relations that hold inside the source frame. So, for example, in the case of flood, the verb activates the flood frame, establishing a connection between immigrants and moving water. The danger posed by flooding and its destructive power is then mapped across to the target situation so that immigration is similarly construed as dangerous and destructive. It then follows that just as we would put barriers in place to prevent flooding, so we should put barriers in place to prevent immigration. Besides the addition of manner, another way in which actual language usage is found in discourses of immigration depart from the default motion event is in the construal of the figure. In our original example, the number or extent of the figure was not specified. However, a common way of conceptualizing migrants is in terms of their usually large numbers. This can be achieved indirectly through verbs encoding manners of motion like flood and flock, which imply a figure made up of large quantities. Or it can be achieved directly through explicit quantifications of the figure. Of course, the two strategies can co-occur, as in the examples we've just seen. Rather than a large number of individual entities, the figure may alternatively be schematized as a single mass. Conceptually, this relates to a distinction Talmy makes between uniplex and multiplex structure. For example, in their plural form, count nouns like migrants encode multiplex structures, construing a group of individual entities as individuals, albeit lumped together under a single social category. By contrast, collective nouns encode uniplex structures, construing a group of individuals as though it were a single object or homogeneous substance. In immigration discourse, a uniplex figure is often evoked by collective nouns that are applied metaphorically, as in flock of migrants, army of asylum seekers, or column of refugees. Construing a group of people with a uniplex structure de-individuates them, occluding attention to their unique identities, histories, desires, and motives. It thus realizes an identification strategy as well as a structural configuration strategy. Verbs expressing manner often provide information about the rate or force of motion. For example, run encodes a faster rate of motion than walk. Similarly, flood encodes a faster and more forceful motion than flow. Functionally, faster motion means a motion event involving larger figure quantities can complete in a shorter period of time. Thus, in examples expressing rapid rates of motion, we not only find quantification of the figure, but also an additional semantic element of time frame, which, expressed by an adverbial phrase, is relatively compressed. When expressed by the verb, as in this example then, rate of motion is imprecise, implied only to be fast, slow, or somewhere in between. In immigration discourse, however, rate of motion is often specified, expressed through facts and figures in an adverbial phrase. Typically, such statistics present the rate of motion in a way that makes it easier to imagine and thus as more alarming. Closely linked to rate of motion is iteration. Motion events can be construed as single events or a series of events defined at given temporal intervals. Again, such intervals are typically shorter rather than longer, days, weeks, months or years rather than decades, centuries or millennia, making the scenario at the same time more tangible and more startling. At the surface level, iteration is typically expressed by an adverbial phrase. Conceptually, iteration relates to plexity. A motion event construed as a one-off happening exhibits a uniplex structure, while a motion event conceived as a series of repeated events is multiplex in structure. Ideologically, in discourses of immigration, motion events construed as iterative or with rapid rates of motion create a sense of unsustainability as the ground is faced with excessive quantities or forces within short periods of time. When a motion event configured this way is anchored in the present, the construal further creates a sense of urgency, with the unmanageable situation requiring immediate interventionist action. One construal operation realizing an identification strategy that is related to the motion event itself is windowing of attention. The complete motion event inherent in the process of immigration involves a figure departing a source, the country of origin, and following a trajectory, the route taken, to eventually arrive at a goal, the destination country. However, when one or other path element is selected as the ground, our attention is focused on this particular portion of the event. In respect to motion events, then, Talmy calls this path windowing and identifies three types: initial path windowing, focused on the source, medial path windowing, focused on the trajectory, and final path windowing, focused on the goal. Of course, multiple grounds may be specified, and if all three path elements are expressed, then our attention is directed over the entire event. This is the case in the hypothetical example here. In practice, however, attested language usages tend to window or select for particular attention different portions of this process, and different verbs are associated with different types of windowing. In immigration discourse, for example, a verb like flee is associated with initial path windowing, while a verb like arrive is associated with final path windowing. A verb like cross is associated with medial path windowing. The reflex of windowing is gapping, which defocuses our attention on the unwindowed portion of the event, so that, for example, final windowing concomitantly involves initial and medial gapping. Note that all three path elements are necessarily present in the conceptualization of any motion event, but those that receive linguistic representation are construed with greater saliency. From a critical perspective, in immigration discourse, windowing of attention and its reflex in gapping can serve to highlight or ignore the causes and consequences of immigration, thus reflecting different discourses. For example, initial windowing can serve to highlight the difficult circumstances which lead people to migrate, and may thus be said to instantiate a more humanitarian discourse. By contrast, final windowing overlooks the impetus for migration and focuses only on its potential impact, which is usually negatively conceived. Final windowing may therefore be associated with more hostile discourses. Okay, so I hope to have given you a flavour of what a discourse analysis conducted within a cognitive linguistic approach might look like. And what I'll do now is say a little bit about things to consider when presenting findings and results. As with many forms of discourse analysis, results emerge through your analysis rather than being something that is the subject of your analysis. As a consequence, findings and results are often presented only implicitly within your analysis. This is in contrast to the standard scientific method of reporting, where results and analyses are presented separately. The principles, however, are the same as for all forms of research. Findings must be presented clearly, succinctly, and systematically. It is likely that in the course of your own research, patterns of representation or key semantic sites where ideology may be enacted will emerge. Such observations constitute part of your findings and should be reflected in the structure and organisation of your analysis. As in the analysis just given then, it is a good idea to group your analysis under subheadings representing emergent themes. But these themes should also be restated and commented on in your conclusion. It is therefore a good idea in your conclusion to identify the main findings from your analysis and state explicitly how they address your research questions. Be clear here about the goals of your project. Did you set out to present a kind of a typological study highlighting the conceptual parameters along which ideology may be enacted in a given domain, as in the study we presented here? Or did you set out to scrutinize a particular set of texts for the frequencies, forms and functions of a given linguistic conceptual phenomenon? In discourse analyses based in cognitive linguistics, the first thing you are likely to have noticed is a fondness for diagrams. It is important to note, though, that these diagrams are not just illustrations created to reflect the analyst's own impressions. Rather, they are born out of theoretical frameworks and follow particular conventions to represent meanings in a way that systematically captures certain semantic properties or distinctions. It is therefore important in producing your own diagrams that you follow these conventions, paying particular attention to detail and explaining what is signified by the different diagrammatic features. Your findings will be both descriptive and interpretive or critical. You may choose to present your descriptive analysis up front and then follow with more interpretive analyses. Alternatively, as in the example we've just given, you may choose to interlace the two types of analysis. Either way, it is important to link form and function, to go beyond describing the conceptualizations evoked by language usages, to consider also their implications for ideology and social action. At the same time, however, you shouldn't privilege a critical analysis over a descriptive one. A major aim of using cognitive linguistics in critical discourse analysis is to offer an account based in a psychologically plausible model of language of how textual choices might achieve ideological influence. A detailed, theoretically informed descriptive analysis is key to this endeavour. More often than not, discourse analyses based in cognitive linguistics are qualitative rather than quantitative. That said, quantitative methods are clearly possible, and there is now an ever-increasing body of work adopting mixed methods in cognitive linguistics-based CDA. This has proved most successful in the area of metaphor. If you are presenting quantitative analysis, then there are a number of important things to remember. First, how you obtained your results must be made apparent to your reader. For example, in most cases, quantitative analysis will be based on the coding of your data. It is important that the reader has some access to this process. This involves giving a clear description of your coding protocol and, minimally, an example of its implementation. Where ethics permit, it is considered good research practice, for the sake of transparency, to make your coded data available for inspection by others. If you are working with a relatively small data set, it is a good idea to include your codings as an appendix. This may be a physical or electronic appendix, depending on the size of your data. Clearly, if you are using auto-annotation methods to analyze very large data sets, it is not possible to present all of the coded data to your reader. Second, be sure to make use of tables and graphs so that quantitative results are readily identifiable and easily digestible. Any quantitative results should be presented as raw numbers, but should also be normalized in some way, presented either as a percentage or as a number per n words. Of course, if you are not conducting a quantitative analysis, then it is important to avoid vague or unsubstantiated quantifications like a lot, more often, or fairly frequent. Similarly, if you are conducting a quantitative analysis but are not presenting inferential statistics, then you should avoid describing quantitative differences as significant. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. Here are the works I've cited in this particular presentation, and I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in the book, you can buy it from Routledge, the publishers, and if you have any questions at all, then I'd be very happy to answer them, and you can reach me via Twitter using this handle here. Thank you very much.